Hello, my name is Amir Singh. I'm a third-year computer science student with an option cybersecurity in the Leslie H. and William L. Collins College of Professional Studies. I am a South Asian and Latinx cisgender male with straight blonde and black hair, a mustache, and a short beard. I'm currently wearing a white shirt, and I use he, him, his pronouns. Um, so a little connection to this topic. In society, power, privilege, and oppression are facets that can generally be summed up through the term intersectionality, which is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a civil rights activist in the year 1989. A lot of my recent personal work and study regarding this topic is about the intersection of identities and issues that I haven't generally seen conflated when talking about racial theory in like a basic 101, such as disability, police brutality, sexuality, and gender. Being a part of Spectrum, John's only LGBTQ plus organization, I've been exposed to how similarly academia, which is rooted and built upon white supremacy, aims to put down so many different interlocked identities, here specifically in regard to race and sexuality and gender. So hearing from these speakers today, hopefully we'll all walk away with more knowledge necessary to start changing the foundations of these institutions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Raj Guevara. I am a junior communications arts major in the Leslie H. and Williams L. Collins College of Professional Studies on the Staten Island campus. I am a Mexican-American male with short black hair. I am wearing glasses and navy blue long sleeve, and I use he, him, his pronouns. Power, privilege, and oppression are experienced differently by everyone, and because of this, I have been trying to educate myself on different point of views, not just mine. We need to be open-minded in different ways that power, privilege, and oppression impact diverse individuals. So then later we can try to have empathy and fight for what is right together.
And welcome to the session of the Racial Justice Conversation, Becoming Agents of Change. Today's topic is impact of power, privilege, and oppression. So every 2 weeks, we'll be presenting a different topic to enrich the knowledge and understanding about racial justice topics. The purposeful intention of the committee to identify panelists, moderators, and openers who are diverse in identity and experience, whose lived experiences and/or scholarship deem them experts, and whose individual narratives can serve as windows and mirrors of our own. Today's panelists are brave, committed, and open to both having and leading these racial justice conversations. We thank them and you. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to perform a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations that can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. St. John's University occupies the ancestral lands of the Matinecock, Rockaway, Lenape, and Canarsie peoples. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. Please join us in giving voice to these truths at every opportunity. The committee will share a link in the chat if you would like to learn more about land acknowledgements. And we hope you are able to review the recommended resources so we can have an informed and fruitful conversation.
Our moderator for today's session is Nigel Gretton. Mr. Gretton is the Rector of Performing Arts and the Adjunct Professor of Music here at St. John's. He also serves as the Artistic Director and Conductor of the Voices of Victory Gospel Choir.
Hello, all. Thank you very much for the introduction. This discussion of power, privilege, oppression, of course, close to my heart. I'll introduce myself. I'm Nigel Gretton. I am an Afro-Caribbean American male. I have dark brown skin, a shaved head. I'm wearing glasses today. I'm wearing a blue shirt and a dark red patterned tie and a blue vest. I'm Director of Performing Arts at St. John's, as well as an adjunct faculty in the Music Division of Art and Design. My pronouns are he, his, him. as we look at the power, privilege, and oppression and the impacts, I'll hear from the panelists first, and then we'll share some stories as we go through our discussion today. So we'll begin with our panelists.
Okay, I think I start. My name is Sanaa Almuddin. I am associate professor in communication, rhetoric, and theater. I have a light complexion. I am a Black Arab, Muslim, Moroccan citizen immigrant, and I am a mother of kids who live with mental illnesses. So all of these make our intersectionalities. I wear today a green dress, and I like to be referred to as she, her, hers. Thank you for having me.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Remy Martin. I am an African American male whose pronouns are he, him, his. I'm currently wearing a blue long sleeve shirt, button up, and short hair I have. And I'm very happy to be here today with such an esteemed set of panelists to talk about these important issues. So thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Candice Roberts. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a white, non-binary person. I have short hair buzzed on the sides. Today I'm wearing glasses and a black shirt and checkered tie. I'm the director of the Communication Arts program on Queens campus and also an assistant professor. I teach media studies, communication theory, and a whole variety of communication media courses. My research deals mostly with representations of identity, particularly queer identity in the media, and intersections of queerness and working class identity across television, film, and digital cultures. And I'm really pleased to be invited here and to be part of this important conversation series here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jean-Pierre Ruiz. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. My affirming pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a middle-aged Latinx male with tan skin, white and gray hair, and a mustache. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm wearing a black clerical shirt with a Roman collar.
Hi, my name's Anne Galvin. I'm a member of the Sociology and Anthropology Department. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I am a white woman with dark curly hair. Today I'm wearing a green blouse, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you, panelists. Enter our discussion today. I'll start with the panelists and just ask for our discussion today how you might define power, privilege, and oppression.
Well, when I think about power and privilege, I think about the things that you don't have to think about when you have power and privilege. So things that might be concerns or worries for people might not even cross your mind because you don't experience them yourself. That's one of the key things that I think about.
Thank you, Anne.
I'll jump in here too. When I think about power, privilege, oppression, I often think about either individuals or a group of individuals that have the ability to impose their ideals, their views, their perspectives on others who do not have that same control, and essentially holding that that force that allows them to push their particular agenda or their perspectives on a various amount of different issues.
Thank you, Remy.
Let me go, if I may. I think it's hard to define power and privilege in the abstract, so let me share a personal experience that illustrates how power and privilege and their opposites work. When I wear this outfit, including when I wear it on campus, a black clerical shirt with a Roman collar. It's the uniform of my status as a Roman Catholic priest. I'm just about always treated with a measure of deference that I wouldn't receive if I were dressed otherwise. It's good morning, Father. It's good afternoon, Father, because the clerical shirt connects me with an institution that lays claim to the kind of power that claims to come from God. An institution where people who dress like this have too often, claimed unmerited privilege that flows from their clerical status. Now, Pope Francis has frequently and very vehemently denounced clericalism as one of the greatest dangers that's threatening the church. You know, after all, Christianity professes to believe in someone who was crucified because he associated with people who didn't have power, who didn't have privilege, and because he challenged the status quo of the Roman Empire, an empire which was really good at the practices of oppression and subjugation. But when I don't wear the uniform, I found that I get treated really differently. As happened one afternoon a couple of winters ago, when I was shoveling the snow from the parking lot of the parish where I live. One of the teachers from the school next door who parked their car in the parking lot came over to me, handed me a $5 bill, and in broken Spanish said, "Muchas gracias." I managed to hold my temper, and I nodded and I smiled without saying a word. But in case you're wondering, yes, I kept the $5 bill. That's power and privilege, and the opposite.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre.
I think I can add a little bit to this, if I may.
Yes,
When I
please.
think about power and privilege, I think about it in the larger groups when we think about Blacks and whites, for instance, but I also think about it in between groups, groups that may be Blacks, but also belong to different types of entities or communities. So where do they get placed? Where do they get subjugated? So for me, it's not just seeing power from one community, white towards Blacks, but also in between groups. And that those intersectionalities that we hardly talk about. For instance, when we talk about intersectionalities, we talk about African Americans and gender or something like that. But what happens with intersectionalities of, for instance, something that comes to my mind, a Muslim who might happen to be transgender, for instance, these things do not even come to our consciousness. And these intersectionalities of the in-betweeners are important to talk and add in this discussion. The other side of it is it's not just about diversity of skin. When we talk about privilege and power, we need to start talking and include also diversity of our brains. And I'm thinking about neurodiverse and mental illnesses that we do not bring to the conversation when we are discussing power and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. To the panelists, I'm going to share a story as a part of our next section of our discussion. It's I have multiple stories, but the one that comes to mind is a story about a summer jobs program, and this particular discussion happened all by telephone. There's a young lady who's a friend of mine. She was having a discussion with a representative from a local county summer jobs office, and she was asking about opportunities for college students for this particular summer experience. And as the person on the other end was reading down the list, she read through several of the different positions and then thought that none of them would actually fit the profile for the person she was speaking with, who's my friend. And she then said, she's kind of listing some titles. My friend selected one and said, "Oh, this sounds like a good one." The person on the other end from the county office said, "Oh, no, we'll save this for one of the Black students. But this for you, I want to give you something else." And of course, my friend who identifies as African American didn't identify herself by race, and because the conversation was by phone, the person on the other end didn't realize who she was speaking with, and of course continued the conversation about what would be a better job for this person because she assumed that she was not African American. So I'll share the story, and in sharing the story, or that part of it, I'll ask this next question to the panelists, and anyone can jump in first who would like to. The question is, how does power and privilege serve to maintain existing inequalities and further oppressions? So anyone can jump in. So Nay, I see you, so I'll ask you first.
So I just want to share some of these thoughts that I had in my mind. Ta-Nehisi Coates says race is a child of racism and not the father. 30 years ago, when I actually arrived here working in the tech industry, I woke up to the intersections of sexism, Islamophobia, also xenophobia, etc., and racism, obviously. In many leadership meetings that I had with the people, it was most of the people that were there were white, and only me as a person of color, right? But going forward, 30 years later, we still have only 7% of women of color in corp America at a higher level, right? This always strikes me very interestingly. If we go to a meeting and we have a lot of people who are in a meeting at a leadership who are white, we don't think anything about it. But if we go to the same meeting in an organization and we have people who belong to the Black, Indigenous people of color, then we start wondering what's going on. And for instance, there are only white tokens in there. We start thinking about what's going on. And let's come to academia even. I mean, to me, this is where the power comes into a relationship. In academia, less than 20% of the people are, or the people are, of faculty are people of color. Still today in 2020, right? Even think about our classrooms and our textbooks that we give to our students. Most of the examples that we have are based on names such as Michelle or Michael or Karen. I hardly see names like Ahmed, Fatim Zahra, or Yujan, or so this is an important factor. There are very minimal examples, but representation is very important in these small decisions. And finally, you cannot avoid any of this power and privilege, even in entertainment. For instance, I'm thinking about Blue Blood as a show that is ranked fourth in the United States. And in it, you can see that most officers are white. I mean, you can guess the whole story. Most officers are white. The narrative still refers to Black officers or Black people who are in the movie or the series as basically tags and gang member, etc. So yes, if you think about it, I wonder if the 8 million of people that follow this show question the power and privileges included or just accept them. In other words, maintaining existing inequalities and furthering oppressions. And it's in the media, it's all over the, whether it's institutionalized or our individual word, we feel it, it's there. So it keeps maintaining itself.
Thank you, Sine. That's a really good connection to exactly what I was going to kind of think about in terms of just exactly what Sine is saying for representation. So in media studies, power really manifests through representation. And a lot of the work that I do on identity and kind of reinforcement of identity through narratives in the media looks at the notion of representation both on screen and behind the screen. So a lot of my work I've built on Stuart Hall's work in cultural studies, and Stuart Hall talks about what he calls the regime of representation. And so this idea is that power doesn't just happen from the dominant group kind of perpetually exerting brute force onto the marginalized groups, but rather power is something that we're all caught up in, right? It affects us all differently, but power is a system. And so Hall says power seduces, power solicits, power sort of sneakily induces and wins our consent. And so in media, this happens really in two ways, right? Because again, just as Sine said, kind of from an ownership and production standpoint, who is behind the camera, whose voices get magnified, how does that translate into what we see on screen? So power in media industries, the kind of two-part process of perpetuation works through one, constraining a lot of marginalized voices, right? Queer people and women, and definitely Black people, people of color. So it constrains and kind of prevents those stories and those people from rising through the ranks. And also power shapes new narratives. So power continually perpetuates itself through people and through those images that we see, through those languages that we see kind of depicted.
Yeah, Candice, you hit on a lot of really, really interesting points, and it made me think about something. When we talk about power, we instantly think of quite a few narratives that come into play. We see white power, Black, minorities are being pushed down. But if I think about it more so in the terms of human nature, there's a part of us all that enjoys power. When we have it, we want to hold on to it. And we are creatures of habit. So once something becomes that norm and you have the power, you don't necessarily want to let it go. And that might be based in fear, that might be based on a lot of different things. But I think that if we start to talk about the ways in which we use the power and privilege that we have to make those differences, depending on whatever form you may be, whether that be media, whether that be arts, whether that be what have you, the Catholic Church, if we start to think about ways to systematically change the way we use the power that we have, I think that might be an interesting first step to make a real change and difference.
Thank you. And we haven't heard from you.
I wanted to pick up on what Sine and Candice were saying with a story from one of my classes, actually. I teach a class called Kinship, Family, and Gender, and because it's an anthropology class, it's really about looking at different models of family, different ideas about gender. And in the class, I decided to try to do this exercise that was supposed to be a demonstration of male privilege. And the exercise was asking students to make a list of the things that they do in order to feel safe before they leave the house. The assumption is that the women's lists are going to be much longer. What I realized when I tried this out in a St. John's classroom was that it was centering a really white, middle-class, heterosexual, cisgender student who's considered the sort of neutral student in the classroom in a lot of ways, in ways that don't actually reflect who our students are a lot of the time. And what happened was an incredible learning moment for me when my student said, well, I'm a Black man, and my mother told me never to leave the house without my ID and some money and making sure my phone is charged in case I have an encounter with the police or something else happens where I need to be able to identify myself. And then he added to that, and I'm also a gay man. So that adds a whole additional layer of needing to strategize to feel safe. And it really opened my eyes to the way a lot of classroom materials and exercises are really centered on this neutral, imaginary white middle-class student in ways that are harmful or exclusionary to the students we actually have in our classrooms. And the nice thing about this situation was, because it's an anthropology class, I was also able to say, okay, so we just found out what the implicit bias was of this exercise. And we got to talk about intersectional identities in a way that I think emphasized the point of the class, actually. So it ended up being a really positive moment that could have been a pretty harmful moment.
Thank you. Thank you all for bringing us this far in the conversation. Now we'll turn things a little bit more personally. Could each of you share a time in which you experienced power, privilege, and oppression in your own lives, in your own professional lives, in your own personal lives. Just kind of share those stories. Anyone can jump in first.
Okay, I'll start, and
Thank you, Sine.
and I can. I want to frame this in two ways. It's not necessarily power and oppression, but it's this in-betweener position that I am located at, and I know there are many of us who are located at, bring these intersectionalities as sometimes that power and oppression manifests itself in different ways. So I want to bring a situation that happened to me in college when I was going to for my doctorate. And as soon as I entered the office of one of my previous professors, right away I was asking him about how to do, how to be, or what kind of thesis statement I can have for my doctorate thesis. And right away he said, "Oh, shouldn't you do something about race or religion?" And I wondered why about me. He knew nothing about me. At that moment, I was doing a lot of work for digital communication. And he just right away, he gave me that as a framing, as a position that I need to hold and be boxed in. On the flip side of it is when I tried to get scholarships from for my master's degree, in these two different situations, I was refused because I was not Black enough. I also was, when I gave some presentations in North Carolina University, A&T, about intersectional identity, I was asked by a student, "How are you Black?" So being in this middle, and I know I'm not alone in here, so it's always an issue that is in between these concepts that we like to use. And so it's an interesting position to be in, and I just try and I want to bring attention to it as well. I'm not, obviously we have to bring attention to everything, the whiteness and anti-Blackness and all of that, but I want to bring attention and shed light on these in-betweenness as well.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to share, let's jump in next and share either your witness to or experience of power, privilege, and oppression, or the effects of.
I'll take a turn here. In preparation for this discussion, I thought of all the different possibilities or different answers I can give for this. And I started to kind of get a little overwhelmed when I was reflecting back on my own experiences, because while I can isolate particular instances, I feel like this is kind of a daily battle, for me as an African American male and having very different worlds. In addition to being a graduate assistant at St. John's and being here for almost 9 years, I'm also I work in a pharmacy. I'm also a teacher. I do a lot of different things, and I find myself, if I think about the effects of power and privilege in my life, I feel like even though there were some things that are systemically put into place that, while were not to affect me and put me down, I feel like it actually wound up being almost helpful in a way, because it allowed me to develop a lot of different skills I may not have had if I were to look differently. And what I mean by those different skills, I think about code switching, and I think about being able to almost camouflage myself in the different worlds. I'm a firm believer that if I had not developed those skills early on, if I didn't have people in my life that told me, if you don't do for yourself, it won't be done. If you don't, come to a meeting and have yourself ready, have your tie together, make sure you don't speak slang or do different things like that, I may not be in the position that I am today, if I didn't have those abilities. So, I think about others who can relate to that, even just being prepared for a meeting, knowing what you're getting into. And there's a whole other layer that has to happen for individuals like myself to successfully, or quote unquote, make it in this system, learning the game. So while there are many different instances that can be pulled from, I'm starting to realize even more the benefits that have come from it. Not saying that it's actually great, but it's an interesting kind of perspective to focus on.
I really like, Remy, what you said about the benefits that we all have and that we don't always notice. And one of the articles in the resources folder for this discussion that I hope everybody will check out is a piece by Roxane Gay called Peculiar Benefits. And that makes me, when I read that, it really resonated with me because she talks about the ways that we all have sort of marginalized aspects of ourselves and our lives, and we also all have privileges and benefits, and that those are the negotiations that we're kind of dealing with all the time. And I remember at St. John's, I was having a meeting with a few students once, and they were kind of talking about their experiences on St. John's campus, and we were talking about what we could sort of say about the student body at St. John's. And I touted this little fact that I love to always say to people, which is the diversity on St. John's campus, and that St. John's is one of the most diverse schools in the country. We're like in the top 3, and compared to places like Rutgers and University of Houston, and I'm always so proud of that fact, and I like to say it whenever I can. And one of the students that I was talking to said, wow, I didn't even know that. And it's funny because every professor I've had is white, and I thought, wow, that is so true, because I so often myself have been in a room with other academics and thought, I always notice when I'm the only queer person in the room, and I always notice how young I often feel compared to senior academics and senior colleagues. And I don't always notice that there are no people of color in the room, or that there's no, maybe there's one person of color in the room. And so it makes me think about when we deal with power and privilege and experiences that we have, it's how we're all always balancing our kind of benefits that we don't even know we have in life.
Can I add on to that for a second?
Sure.
Thinking about higher ed and in particular inclusion in higher ed, it's been really eye-opening to see the barriers that people face based on not having intergenerational wealth, and the ways that systems in higher ed are in some ways set up to assume that people have resources they can use until they're reimbursed for that conference that they had to put on their credit card, or that they have moving expenses, and they can afford to kind of balance everything while they're moving and starting a new job and waiting for a paycheck and that kind of thing. And the way that in a sense is a gatekeeper in terms of who starts out with an advantage, who's able to succeed, and who's kind of trying to always catch up in ways that are really difficult. So I thought that's interesting in relation to this idea of faculty diversity on campus as opposed to the student diversity that we have.
On this, a couple of experiences. It was the case as Barack Obama was running for president that he was accused by reporters, and it was a strange accusation. He was accused of being so articulate. I had a so articulate moment some 5 years ago when Pope Francis visited the United States, and I was doing coverage of that event. In fact, I was doing a radio interview by telephone for an AM radio talk show in Boston. And the interview went fairly well, I thought, until I hung up the phone and only learned afterwards from friends who were listening to the interview in the Boston metro area that one of the co-hosts said, "Oh, he speaks so very well. I wish that I had his voice as the voice answering my voicemail." This was a he's so articulate moment, not expecting that a Latino would speak the strange way that I speak with the peculiar accent that I happen to have. And I wasn't hearing this, so it was an exercise of the power of being the host of the show, even though I didn't have the chance to speak for myself since I had already signed off and was off for the rest of my business for the day. I still remember that.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, panelists. In moving our discussion a little bit further, so much to jump on here, but I'm still trying to also be mindful of our time together. So I'm reluctantly going to address another area for all of us, which is kind of based on our own areas of expertise, how our particular area of expertise, our particular set of interests, and what ways they might actually assist in moving things forward and eliminating oppression and helping to shift power dynamics. So I'll start with Remy and ask the question: in what ways can music and the arts help shift power dynamics and serve as a means of rebellion against oppression? If you would speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Um, for all those who may not know, my background, while it's very science related with teaching, etc., it's also very heavily involved in music. And I often like to see uh, how music can serve as a tool to be able to get anything achieved. So a lot of my research is based in the ways in which music can actually help with vocabulary acquisition or even just a true engagement in learning, and how it can spark interest in academia, especially in science academia for students of color, urban students altogether. So when I think about your question specifically, in the ways music can actually help speak out against oppression, I feel like it has been done and is continually done in all of our history. I think back to songs like "Fight the Power" by Public Enemy, right? People are using their fan base, their reach, to be able to send out a message and to speak out about their experiences. Music continually serves as a tool that connects people of all different colors, all different religions, all different backgrounds, and so on and so forth. So to be able to use that power, in a sense, to be able to reach out to a mass amount of people, you're getting a chance that's really unique, where you get to expose people to different ideas or different perspectives that they may not necessarily have come across in their day-to-day lives. I think it's so important. Even more recently, if you think about songs from the artist Childish Gambino, for all of our younger listeners, and even some of our older listeners who love that kind of music, or young or long time listeners, his song "This Is America." The visuals in that piece, if you haven't seen it, go on YouTube. It is very good. You get to kind of see a glimpse into the experience of the Black male, the Black female, and people in color all together, and just what that is like. For if I were to imagine myself as a middle-aged Caucasian male, I probably would never even know that these things are happening, because that's not what I see in my day-to-day life. All of my friends, they're all just like me. They're all doing well. If they need something, it's bought. If they want to go somewhere, they go. To be able to see something outside of yourself is so very important. And music consistently serves as a tool to be able to experience that and express that. Even more recently on Saturday Night Live, that's a show that connects many millions of individuals. And this, I think it was just this last Saturday, Megan Thee Stallion, a rapper that's popular right now, she has a song called Savage. Now, while the message of the song is not about racial inequality, she used that platform and that word to be able to talk about the Breonna Taylor case. And she specifically had some words to share about the general attorney there and how he dealt with the conclusion of that case, or the continued work in that case. So just that in itself, she used her own fan population, the population on Saturday Night Live, to take that 20 seconds to be able to say, you need to hear this, say their names. So I think it's really important. It's a very unique style for people to be able to use their talents and their abilities to be able to discuss things that are important that maybe people wouldn't experience otherwise.
Thank you. Please, panelists, join in at any point and talk about just how your particular area might actually be helpful, or even if you can identify some ways in which their people were excluded from conversations and things that affect them directly. So, Anne, I'll ask you to take that and go with it.
Thanks. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I do research in Jamaica in the West Indies, which clearly has a long history of colonization and a lot of contemporary dynamics that grew out of colonization. And right now I'm looking at issues about environmental conflict involving river water, which is a really important resource. In particular, it's a situation that's really framed by colonization because the polluter on the river is a sugar plantation, which has been there since the 1600s, which is now a contemporary rum company. They're polluting the river in ways that deeply affect the livelihood of poor rural people who essentially patch together a life by fishing on the river and eating fish or selling the fish for extra money. The river is also a recreational space for them. And this pollution directly impacts them in ways that they don't have a lot of control over, because when I talk to people, they really say they don't feel like the little people get listened to. One of the things that I'm really hoping to do in this project is, though, to say there's a stereotype of poor rural people in Jamaica that they don't care about the environment. And what I'm being told by people affected by this pollution is that they absolutely do care about the environment and they would like to have more input into what happens in their communities, but they don't see an outlet for making that happen. So really, I hope that the work that I'm doing is going to kind of amplify what they're already talking about so that there's more discussion of the ways they are concerned and things they can do and opportunities to create partnerships where these things that they're affected by can actually be addressed in ways that are helpful to them and have a meaningful long-term improvement for them.
Thank you, Anne. Another idea comes to mind as I listen to your example with persons having a voice. It's I remembered in a community right near my community where there was a project, a mall project that was on the table, and although environmental impact studies show that there might be a negative impact, the persons who fought the hardest were the persons who didn't live close to the impact site, but actually had lots to say about how it would impact the community in general. The persons closest to the impact site, primarily persons of color, they actually did not really have much to say and didn't really have a voice at the table. They were invited by the developers to a series of lunches and dinners where they were being convinced that the particular project was going to be in their best interest because it will provide jobs to the community and it would mean some economic relief for them. Never mind, their quality of life will be negatively impacted. And so it's the idea of the power brokers actually being the gatekeepers is also an example of all of this. So thank you, Anne, and it kind of just triggered a memory. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the perpetuation of oppressive images and stereotypes that are examples of power and privilege that happen even in a glorified way in the media, and ask Candice if you could speak to just those kinds of examples and how, in fact, that's been perpetuated.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. So I would say in connection to something that Anne said, also, regulations and especially the sort of privileging of corporate conglomerates and kind of capitalism at all costs, right? That is also in effect with the media, and kind of as I talked about before, the idea that these big companies and conglomerates are sort of privileged, and we know that the inside, the sort of stakeholders of those companies are very often people who are just perpetuating kind of media as it has been and the status quo. And so that bears out in the content we see. And a quick thing about stereotypes, I think, that are important for us to kind of note is that stereotypes, at the very core of what they do are schemas. And so they help our brains to organize things in really quick fashion. So I like to give the example of, like, we see a table, and even if we've never seen that table before, we recognize it as a table because it's flat on top and has 4 supportive pillars that are legs, right? so that we're able to look at a table and know that that belongs in a category, even if we've never seen that before. So schemas are kind of human things that our brains do, and stereotypes are sort of negative often, not always, but often negative schemas. And so when we see stereotypes in the media, what happens is the storytellers, often the people who are able to have the privilege and power to create stories, they take an individual or a group of individuals, for example, and they reduce them down and flatten them down to their, some set of characteristics or traits. They essentialize. So then we see, even in a contemporary sense, like stereotypes that I talk about with my students, racialized stereotypes, things like the angry Black man. And so it doesn't mean that there's never been any Black man who's also angry. It means that in the worst kind of media stories and narratives, we see an individual reduced down to a flat set of non-nuanced traits and characteristics. And when we see those often enough, right, this meaning associated with this image, when we see this emotion associated with this person often enough, we integrate it into our schemas, right? And so I think, in a broader sense, I'll end on some kind of a good note, right, about regulation. In a broader sense, I think that a positive thing that's happened in the past, especially 15 years with media, is that technologies to create media have become more democratized, by which I mean so many more people can have a smartphone right now and can have access to social media and can have access to sort of telling their stories and making that conversation, though certainly the playing field is not leveled, it is more of a dialogue than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, so that we have not just those top-down voices speaking and, creating the narratives, but we have a lot more bottom-up voices as well.
Thank you, Candice. So would you say that then the democratization of technology is helping to kind of erode some of the past misdeeds?
I think there is potential, right? Technologies, as we know, are not neutral, right? Even the technology itself is wrapped up in those same systems that we're talking about, those same problems. But I would say, yes, there is a light, there is a shift, right? There is a tide shift that comes from just having more people able to participate in the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Shifting gears a little bit, again, going to Jean-Pierre, just a question for you. Since media often perpetuates not media, but religion, there's talk about how there's liberation for some, but it can also be oppression for others. Talk about your experience with that or observation.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, Christianity had its beginnings in the work of a person who ended his life nailed to a Roman cross because he had some outrageous things to say, like, blessed are you who are poor, and even more outrageous, woe to you who are rich. So the first followers of Jesus, besides that, were something of a ragtag bunch of fisher folk and tax collectors and disreputable people who were marginalized in the society in which they lived. These were people who ostensibly had very, very little claim to power as it was conventionally known. Things took a really significant turn, and largely for the worse, when Christianity became the official religion of the empire. And when people took advantage of the power and the privilege that accompanied that recognition. I think it was Remy who said a little bit earlier that having power feels good. And these formerly disempowered people who were now large and in charge felt really good about having power. This was the kind of Christianity. It was Christendom that dominated Europe, and that under that mantle accompanied the European colonizers to Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. And this was a project that brought with it all kinds of baggage, along with the strange claim that all of this was for the sake of spreading the gospel of Jesus. Jesus would probably have not recognized his gospel in a good bit of what was taking place. But it's also been the case that there's always been a prophetic voice at the core of Christianity, with people who've been willing to call the church to task on those sorts of things, to reform and even to repentance. Now it so happens that we hear that voice, that prophetic voice, speaking Argentinian accented Spanish. In the strangest turn in many hundreds of years, we have the first Bishop of Rome who comes from the global south. And this is a man who writes that he wants a poor church, a church that casts aside its trappings of power and privilege, a poor church for and with the poor, which suggests to me that there is hope in this thing that we call Christianity, hope that we can overcome our worst selves, ourselves that are inclined to cling to power and privilege, and to take sides with those who are powerless and who are marginalized.
Thank you. To switch gears a little bit again, within the same in the same area, of course, talking about intersectionality for Sine, how would you say intersectionality is impacted by power, privilege, and oppression? You spoke to some of this earlier, but could you give us any more insight?
I do research in identity and intersectionality, and when I discovered this word, it meant so much to me because it gave me a voice to exist as an intersection in this space of intersectionality. So instead of saying in between or things like that, it gave me that possibility, and I think that's where its power is located. Not only it's able to bring to light these different types of groups between, the intersections of the larger groups, but it also can bring these groups that are in between. I'm thinking about, for instance, an Arab person like me and a Muslim person who might be Arabic or not. They have the possibility to use intersectionality to talk about the oppressions and the powers and the privileges that they can find in the racial hierarchy, right? On the other hand, there are some troubles with intersectionality as far as I'm concerned. So for instance, it allows someone who's, let's say, white or white passing Arab, for instance. I'm going to focus on my own community here for a second, who's white passing Arab or Muslim and veiled, in other words, not visible Muslim, does not have a veil or a burqa, to ignore white privilege because they pass as white and they pass in the whiteness, right? Not only that, I mean, again, this is a hypothetical phrase here, but it does happen. Not only that, but someone who has all these descriptions might turn around in the hierarchy of racial hierarchy and looks down on someone with the darker complexion. In other words, anti-Blackness. And this happens not just in the Arabic community, it happens in different communities, right? So the oppressed becomes the oppressor, right? And that's an issue with intersectionality and its impact, how I see it. In other words, on one hand, it helps bringing forth all of these intersectionalities and the oppressions, but also it makes this gap in a little bit farther with the racial hierarchy. So that's something that I feel it has an issue with. But also, if I bring it to, we spend a lot of time talking about our skin color and skin diversity, but I think it's very important, equally as important, to talk about our brain diversity. And this is something that we don't bring forward, even in intersectionality, which is very important to bring, because in many ways, if you look, and I'm going to connect back to what Candice was talking about schematas and with the associations that we make in our heads based on the media. For instance, even though there is 1 in 5 people in America who live with some sort of mental illness or mental health issues, and now with COVID, there's even more issues that are to go around, we still see in TV and social media and other places, the use of these diagnoses as metaphors. So we hear things like, stop being schizophrenic, or we hear things like, don't be bipolar, and these are things that people who live with them, they struggle on a daily basis, yet we just use them that way in many instances. So to me, bringing these issues to inclusions, when we're talking about inclusions, when we talk about intersectionality and things like that, it's very important to bring these issues about mental health, about what I call diverse brains that people live with in our society, and we should not be fearful of them. We should not be shy about bringing it out because it's part of the inclusion and it gets marginalized, and we don't talk about it. Only we talk about it in an insulting way or in completely ignoring it. So that's something that I would like to just bring also in this conversation when we're talking about oppression and inclusivity and all of that.
Thank you,
Wow.
Sinead. With someone else, with someone jumping in? Remy, sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in. Sine, you said a lot of wonderful things, but one thing that just stood out to me the most was that topic of the oppressed becoming the oppressor, and it helped me think about a little vignette of something in my own personal life. Oftentimes, and this I'm sure happens in multiple different type of cultures, but just thinking of my own experience as an African American male, especially, I could think back to family members of mine, when I come to them in excitement about, oh, I just got 100 on this test, or I just succeeded in this next thing, and they said to you, oh, well, that's for white folks. Why do you talk so white, or why do and then that kind of narrative of you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be, out here with us walking down the corner, or etc. And even just when applying for school, coming to St. John's, I was told, well, I don't know if you should try St. John's. Maybe you should try Suffolk Community. That might be a good first step. A lot of people from Central High School, they go there first. And thank God I had a mother who always instilled the importance of education, because when you think about being intellectual at all, that is the first step. Learning and acquiring new knowledge is the first step to reversing all of those negative narratives that have been pushed in front of us, whether it be in the media, whether it be from our own family, And I think about it, racism isn't something that we're born with. Treating somebody else just from the way they look isn't something that just happens because that's just the way it is. It's taught. It gets passed down, and it comes from the people that have that perpetuate it in their own existence and their experiences, and they bring that down to the next generation. So while, of course, I love all my family, I've had to be able to put people in their own little columns and know, okay, where you are in your experiential journey and where you are in your development, this is your frame of reference. So I can't necessarily be upset with you, but if I've tried to attempt to help you get to that next level, and you decide to stay where you are, that's okay, but I'm going to have to go this way. But it's the enemy to inequity is knowledge. I think that is definitely an important first step, but it's interesting how you can see even within families how that oppressed narrative, whether they realize it or not, is now taking a flip, and they are becoming the oppressors and teaching those negative things to those next generations. So I feel for those individuals who may not have access to different experiences or allow themselves to take that first step to reversing the things that they've been taught their whole lives. I'm still now, even with colorism, I'm still unlearning things that I've had be the norm for a lot of my life, and I feel like that's a struggle for a lot of people, especially in this time. Candice, you had mentioned with having more access to technology. I feel like, with everything happening with Black Lives Matter this year and all the cases, these are things that have been happening for years and years and years. But its volume is a lot louder now because I feel like there are a lot of more people that are able to speak on it or see those things visually through social media, through, their outlets. That you're getting more of the story than just what's told on the news. You're starting to see it hands-on, and it's people in your neighborhood, people in your communities, your schools, your jobs, and that conversation is a lot louder. So this is an important time. I'm glad that we're having this discussion now, even in our own place at St. John's.
Thank you, Remy. Thank you, Sinead. Thank you, Candice, thank you. Jean-Pierre, thank you. Anne. Now, I want to move in our remaining moments just to talk about a way forward. And Sine and Remy, you set us up for a wonderful transition to our next phase, which is the way forward, and talking about strategies versus solutions. Because clearly, in this very short discussion, even this very short series of each 90-minute segment, we can't possibly get to a place where we solve this ongoing problem that's been going on. A phrase came to mind, a recent quote, I think from Will Smith, who said something about that the conditions have always been here, but now they're just being recorded. And of course, Candice, you definitely highlighted the fact that there's many more ways that folks have access now to share, and it's become a lot more level the playing field. So now going forward, and I'll call on Anne first to talk about the possible tools from different perspectives that can be used as a way of beginning to strategize to correct some of the wrongs that have been created against groups that have been oppressed. So, Anne, if you will.
So I was thinking about this through anthropology because it's a social science where really what we do is observe and talk to people, and that's how we get data for our research. We really have to think about our own biases a lot when we're collecting data so that we know we're not interpreting things in a way that's just being filtered through our own perspective. One of the tools that we use to prepare to do interviewing and observation is called trying to be reflexive. And essentially what that means is you're recognizing moments when you're interacting with people where you're feeling uncomfortable or upset or emotional. And rather than being reactive to that feeling, you sit and think about it and think about why you're having that reaction. If there's a conflict of values you're feeling or some other kind of tension that you're feeling. And then the important thing in anthropology is that those moments are not moments where you break off the discussion and it creates a barrier that's insurmountable, but it represents a moment where you should have more discussion and ask better and more questions. And I also thought it was interesting because it really connected with the piece that Father Ruiz chose from Father Massengale, where he's talking about the situation that happened with the Central Park bird watcher. And he has this quote where he says, "First understand the difference between being uncomfortable and being threatened." Talking about when white people are in interactions with people of color specifically, and they're interpreting an experience they're having as an active threat. In the case of that Central Park bird watcher, the woman called the police on the man for asking her to leash her dog. And she turned a moment of discomfort into something that felt threatening for her, but then she turned it on the bird watcher, who was African American, and essentially turned it into a real threat for him when she called the police and said she was telling them he was threatening her life. So this is a really slightly different set of contexts, but it's sort of the same technique where rather than reacting and going with whatever your first feeling is in the situation, you start asking yourself questions about how you're absorbing the information you're receiving and what about you is creating the kind of reaction. And I think that's really important for people with privilege to sort of move forward beyond knee-jerk reactions in situations where we're really using our power in harmful ways rather than in ways where we try to understand what's happening in a better, more accurate, more kind of caring way.
Thank you, Anne. Candice, can you speak to tools and media that can actually be helpful in this particular quest?
So I want to say something, I'm going to try to be quick. It's a little bit more about less media centric and just more communication focused. The adage that I always like to use is reach up, reach down. And so when we try to organize and mobilize for social change, the way to do that is building strong networks. As an individual, know your own identity. You identify somebody you trust who has just a little bit more power than you do, and you connect with that person. You identify somebody who has just a little bit less power than you do, and you connect with that person. And it also works not just at the individual, but then at the group level. So then we form a little collective of people. My student group, the LGBTQ affinity group on campus, and they can identify another group on campus that is like-minded. So reach up, reach down. Somebody that has a little bit more power than you, connect with them, and somebody who has a little bit less power than you, connect with them.
Great, thank you. And Remy, in the arts.
Well, I'm also, before I even talk about the arts, just like Candice, I'll keep it short. I think in a really important step forward, and you kind of shined light on this, taking that process of critical evaluation. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves, even amongst all of the different levels, whether you're higher on the power totem pole or deeper down lower. You have to kind of see where you fall on that line and address the things that you bring out and bring forth that perpetuate these ideas of inequality and preparedness, etc. Because fear is natural, but allowing it to consume you is just a result of being unprepared or a lack of knowledge, right? So an important step forward, I think even at the St. John's level and so far out, is addressing policy and being able to actually hear and reach down, like Candice said, to other individuals so they can actually have a moment to share their experiences. And for ourselves, you know, we have to be able to, instead of just listening just to respond, actually listen to learn and to develop and say, hey, maybe that was an experience I wasn't aware of. How can I make a change that's effective? And that would be really helpful. But in terms of music, just kind of what I mentioned before, being able to have individuals, and whether that be through song, through poetry writing, through arts, drawing, physical arts, whatever it may be, allowing yourself to use your platform, use your outreach to be able to send out messages, especially messages on inequity and anti-racism and everything else in between, because there are individuals that sometimes when they're having a conversation, they may not know how to start the conversation, or they may not be able to feel comfortable addressing or battling those internal things that happen that allow them to make the choices that they make. But music might be an interesting outlook to facilitate or start a conversation, or at least start to spark up some ideas and thoughts on, maybe I should challenge my views. Maybe what I have done or what my parents taught me for my whole life, maybe there is something wrong with that. Or if there isn't, let's just have a discussion and let's figure out what those next steps are. So if anything, I think music might be a tool or a segue to the change that needs to happen in our worlds and in ourselves.
Thank you, Remy. And Sine, especially dealing with in mental health stigmas, tools that might be appropriate here.
It is important to self-reflect is very important, dialogue, and then action. For me, self-reflection, and I'll just spend a moment about race. For instance, in my own self-reflection, I figured out that I cannot call myself an African American because I or my family had never dealt with the trauma of 500 years. And this is an important factor to keep in mind. But if you talk about inquiry and dialogue, opening this conversation, such as what we are doing here, it's a really an important thing to have in between different types of people to talk about it. And finally, action, which for me is advocating for something. My beef is mental illness and mental health, and for me, in St. John's, we can do a lot more, for instance, than counseling, than just having counseling for our students, for our faculty. Having something, changing our language is very important. It starts with language. The same way we are caring and bringing forth this whole idea about pronouns, we should do something like that about with mental illness stigma, to reduce that stigma. So decreasing words that are used as metaphors instead of diagnosis, for instance, or just something as simple as opening our floors to other things, resources that can help with anxiety management, for instance. So I am thinking about meditation. It's such a small tool that other universities, such as Stanford University, have employed in their for faculty and also for students, and it has been helping students as well as faculty and staff to deal with their stress level, anxiety, etc., especially with what is going on. And I'm just going to market this for just a second. I actually, we have a center for a workshop that is coming next Wednesday to give the St. John's community a meditation session next Wednesday in this hour. And I hope that many of us can join to clean our minds and relieve some of the stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. And finally, Jean-Pierre, religious beliefs, values, and practices. How in religion, what tools can we use for religions to help solve this issue?
Sure. When I served as a member of the U.S. State Department's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy during the Obama administration, something that we emphasized over and over and over again is that at least 80% of the world's population makes important decisions on the basis of their religious values and beliefs. So religion is really, really important. And yet religion is associated with exclusivism, and religious people can be very, very good at othering and exclusion. And sometimes that othering and that exclusion, if I'm right, you must be wrong. If I believe this, then what you believe must be wrong. More often than not, that exclusion and that othering is a product of ignorance, of not encountering the person who believes differently, who holds a different religious faith, who practices a different religion than I do. I think very concretely, one of the opportunities that St. John's University offers us, because of the religious diversity that's present in our university community, is the opportunity to encounter someone who believes differently than we do, whether or not we happen to be religious, whether or not we happen to be affiliated with one religious tradition of practice or another. We have the opportunity to engage people who believe differently and to learn from them and to learn with them. I think that's a very important way of equalizing. I think that's a very important way of recognizing and honoring the dignity of members of our university community and of the larger community. Recognize that what we have in common gives us a power that is very, very transformative. And so I would encourage people very concretely, talk to somebody who believes differently than you do. Engage with them seriously. Religion is one of those things that you're not supposed to talk about, but everybody's talking about politics these days. Why not talk seriously about religion? Why not expand your views and expand your horizons?
Thank you very much. Folks, as we draw closer to the close, want to thank everyone for your participation, for your voices. I'm actually looking to see if I see any additional questions from those persons who are in attendance. And actually, I see there was a question which has actually been answered and acknowledged. So thank you all very much. And this has been a good discussion, and I took many, many notes and a lot of food for thought. I hope it was helpful for those persons listening as well. We'll actually turn it back over to our closing remarks from Roger. And thank you all very much.
Okay. Hello. Thank you, Mr. Gretton, Dr. Almuden, Dr. Galvin, Mr. Martin, Dr. Roberts, Reverend Ruiz, for leading this conversation. Thank you to all the 156 attendees for joining today's session. A list of next steps action will be available on our series website within 1 week. It will be at stjohns.edu/racial-justice. The video will be posted a week from today, and it could be rewatched and shared with others. Just a reminder that it is our plan that any unanswered questions will be gathered and addressed in the future conversations. We have another topic coming up. The next topic is A Way Forward, Dismantling Systemic Oppression, which will happen in 2 weeks on Wednesday, October 21st at 6 p.m. Please take a few minutes to fill out the short event feedback survey. The survey will appear once you click the exit the session. The series information, future session details, anything that will be related to the session we had today, and the past sessions and future sessions, and all type of recordings will be found at stjohns.edu/racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.